Chapter 23, Part 4 of Volume 3 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Volume 3 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 23, The 100 Years' War, Charles VI and the Dukes of Burgundy, Part 4. While this tragic incident was taking place in Eastern Europe, the court of the Mad King was falling a victim to rivalries, intrigues, and scandals which, towards the close of this reign, were to be the curse and the shame of France. There had grown up between Queen Isabel of Bavaria and Louis, Duke of Orleans, brother of the king, an intimacy which, throughout the city and amongst all honourable people, shocked even the least straight-laced. It was undoubtedly through the Queen's influence that Charles VI, in 1402, suddenly decided upon putting into the hands of the Duke of Orleans the entire government of the realm and the right of representing him in everything during the attacks of his malady. The Duke of Burgundy wrote at once about it to the Parliament of Paris, saying, "Take counsel and pains that the interests of the king and his dominion be not governed as they now are, for in good truth it is a pity and a grief to hear what is told me about it." The accusation was not grounded solely upon the personal ill temper of the Duke of Burgundy. His nephew, the Duke of Orleans, was elegant, affable, volatile, good-natured. He had for his partisans at court all those who shared his worse than frivolous tastes and habits, and his political judgment was no better than his habits. No sooner was he invested with power than he abused it strangely. He levied upon the clergy as well as the people an enormous talliage, and the use he made of the money increased still further the wrath of the people. An Augustine monk named James Legrand, already celebrated for his writings, had the hardihood to preach even before the court against abuses of power and licentiousness of morals. The king rose up from his own place and went and sat down right opposite the preacher. "Yes, sir," continued the monk, "the king your father, during his reign, did likewise lay taxes upon the people, but with the produce of them he built fortresses for the defense of the kingdom. He hurled back the enemy and took possession of their towns, and he effected a saving of treasure, which made him the most powerful among the kings of the West. But now there is nothing of this kind done. The height of nobility in the present day is to frequent bagnios, to live in debauchery, to wear rich dresses with pretty fringes and big cuffs. This, O Queen," he added, "is what is said to the shame of the court, and if you will not believe me, put on the dress of some poor woman and walk about the city, and you will hear it talked of by plenty of people." In spite of his malady and his affection for his brother, Charles VI, either from pure feebleness or because he was struck by those truths so boldly proclaimed, yielded to the counsels of certain wise men who represented to him that it was neither a reasonable nor an honourable thing to entrust the government of the realm to a prince whose youth needed rather to be governed than to govern. He withdrew the direction of affairs from the Duke of Orleans and restored it to the Duke of Burgundy, who took it again and held it with a strong grasp, and did not suffer his nephew Louis to meddle in anything. But from that time forward open distrust and hatred were established between the two princes and their families. In the very midst of this court crisis, Duke Philip the Bold fell ill and died within a few days, on the 27th of April, 1404. He was a prince, valiant and able, ambitious, imperious, eager in the pursuit of his own personal interests, careful in humouring those whom he aspired to rule, and disposed to do them good service in whatever was not opposed to his own ends. He deserved and possessed the confidence and affection not only of his father King John, but also of his brother Charles V, a good judge of wisdom and fidelity. He founded that great house of Burgundy, which was for more than a century to eclipse and often to deplorably compromise France, but Philip the Bold loved France sincerely, and always gave her the chief place in his policy. His private life was regular and staid, amidst the scandalous licentiousness of his court. He was of those who leave behind them unfeigned regret and an honored memory, without having inspired their contemporaries with any lively sympathy. John the Fearless, Count of Nevers, his son and successor in the dukedom of Burgundy, was not slow to prove that there was reason to regret his father. His expedition to Hungary, for all its bad leadership and bad fortune, had created esteem for his courage and for his firmness under reverses, but little confidence in his direction of public affairs. He was a man of violence, unscrupulous and indiscreet, full of jealousy and hatred, and capable of any deed and any risk for the gratification of his passions or his fancies. At his accession he made some popular moves. He appeared disposed to prosecute vigorously the war against England, which was going on sluggishly. He testified a certain spirit of conciliation by going to pay a visit to his cousin, the Duke of Orleans, lying ill at his castle of Botte, near Vincennes. When the Duke of Orleans was well again, the two princes took the communion together, and dined together at their uncle's, the Duke of Berry's, and the Duke of Orleans invited the new Duke of Burgundy to dine with him the next Sunday. The Parisians took pleasure in observing these little matters, and in hoping for the re-establishment of harmony in the royal family. They were soon to be cruelly undeceived. On the 23rd of November 1407, the Duke of Orleans had dined at Queen Isabel's. He was returning about 8 in the evening along Fil du Temple, singing and playing with his glove, and attended by only 2 squires riding 1 horse, and by 4 or 5 valets on foot, carrying torches. It was a gloomy night, not a soul in the streets. When the Duke was about 100 paces from the Queen's hostel, 18 or 20 armed men, who had lain in ambush behind a house called Image de Notre Dame, dashed suddenly out. The squires' horses took fright and ran away with them, and the assassins rushed upon the Duke, shouting, "Death! Death!" "What is all this?" said he. "I am the Duke of Orleans." "Just what we want," was the answer, and they hurled him down from his mule. He struggled to his knees, but the fellows struck at him heavily with axe and sword. A young man in his train made an effort to defend him, and was immediately cut down, and another, grievously wounded, had but just time to escape into a neighboring shop. A poor cobbler's wife opened her window, and seeing the work of assassination, shrieked, "Murder! Murder!" "Hold your tongue, you strumpet!" cried someone from the street. Others shot arrows at the windows where lookers-on might be. A tall man wearing a red cap, which came down over his eyes, said in a loud voice, "Out with all lights, and away!" The assassins fled at the top of their speed, shouting, "Fire! Fire!" throwing behind them foot-trippers, and by menaces causing all the lights to be put out, which were being lighted here and there in the shops. The Duke was quite dead. One of his squires, returning to the spot, found his body stretched on the road and mutilated all over. He was carried to the neighboring church of Blancs-Manteaux, whither all the royal family came to render the last sad offices. The Duke of Burgundy appeared no less afflicted than the rest. "Never," said he, "was a more wicked and traitorous murder committed in this realm." The provost of Paris, Sieur de Tignouville, set on foot an active search after the perpetrators. He was summoned before the council of princes, and the Duke of Berry asked him if he had discovered anything. "I believe," said the provost, "that if I had leave to enter all the hostels of the king's servants, and even of the princes, I could get on the track of the authors or accomplices of the crime." He was authorized to enter wherever it seemed good to him. He went away to set himself to work. The Duke of Burgundy, looking troubled and growing pale, "Cousin," said the King of Naples, Louis d'Anjou, who was present at the council, "can you know aught about it? You must tell us." The Duke of Burgundy took him, together with his uncle, the Duke of Berry, aside, and told them that it was he himself who, tempted of the devil, had given orders for this murder. "O God!" cried the Duke of Berry, "then I lose both my nephews." The Duke of Burgundy went out in great confusion, and the council separated. Research brought about the discovery that the crime had been for a long while in preparation, and that a Norman nobleman, Raoul d'Auquetonville, late Receiver General of Finance, having been deprived of his post by the Duke of Orleans for malversation, had been the instrument. The Council of Princes met the next day at the Hôtel de Nesle. The Duke of Burgundy, who had recovered all his audacity, came to take his seat there. Word was sent to him not to enter the room. Duke John persisted, but the Duke of Berry went to the door and said to him, "Nephew, give up the notion of entering the council. You would not be seen there with pleasure." "I give up willingly," answered Duke John, "and that none may be accused of putting to death the Duke of Orleans, I declare that it was I and none other who caused the doing of what has been done." Thereupon he turned his horse's head, returned forthwith to the Hôtel d'Artois, and taking only 6 men with him, he galloped without a halt, except to change horses, to the frontier of Flanders. The Duke of Bourbon complained bitterly at the council that an immediate arrest had not been ordered. The Admiral de Brabant and 100 of the Duke of Orleans' knights set out in pursuit, but were unable to come up in time. Neither Raoul d'Auquetonville nor any other of the assassins was caught. The magistrates, as well as the public, were seized with stupor in view of so great a crime and so great a criminal. But the Duke of Orleans left a widow, who, in spite of his infidelities and his irregularities, was passionately attached to him. Valentine Visconti, the Duke of Milan's daughter, whose dowry had gone to pay the ransom of King John, was at Château Thierry, where she heard of her husband's murder. Hers was one of those natures full of softness and at the same time of fire, which grief does not overwhelm, and in which a passion for vengeance is excited and fed by their despair. She started for Paris in the early part of December 1407, during the roughest winter, it was said, ever known for centuries, taking with her all her children. The Duke of Berry, the Duke of Bourbon, the Count of Clermont, and the Constable went to meet her. Herself and all her train in deep mourning, she dismounted at the hostel of St. Paul, threw herself on her knees before the king with the princes and council around him, and demanded of him justice for her husband's cruel death. The chancellor promised justice in the name of the king, who added with his own lips, "We regard the deed relating to our own brother as done to ourselves." The compassion of all present was boundless, and so was their indignation, but it was reported that the Duke of Burgundy was getting ready to return to Paris, and with what following and for what purpose would he come? Nothing was known on that point. There was no force with which to make a defense. Nothing was done for the Duchess of Orleans. No prosecution began. As much vexed and irritated as disconsolate, she set out for Blois with her children, being resolved to fortify herself there. Charles had another relapse of his malady. The people of Paris, who were rather favorable than adverse to the Duke of Burgundy, laid the blame of the king's new attack and of the general alarm upon the Duchess of Orleans, who was off in flight. John the Fearless actually re-entered Paris on the 20th of February 1408 with 1,000 men-at-arms, amidst popular acclamation and cries of "Long live the Duke of Burgundy!" Having taken up a strong position at the Hôtel d'Artois, he sent a demand to the king for a solemn audience, proclaiming his intention of setting forth the motives for which he had caused the Duke of Orleans to be slain. The 8th of March was the day fixed. Charles VI, being worse than ever that day, was not present. The Dauphin, Louis, Duke of Guise, a child of 12 years, surrounded by the princes, councillors, a great number of lords, doctors at the university, burgesses of note, and people of various conditions, took his father's place at this assembly. The Duke of Burgundy had entrusted a Norman Cordelier, Master Jean Petit, with his justification. The monk spoke for more than 5 hours, reviewing sacred history and the histories of Greece, Rome, and Persia, and the precedents of Phineas, Absalom, the son of David, Queen Athaliah, and Julian the Apostate, to prove that it is lawful, and not only lawful, but honorable and meritorious, in any subject, to slay or cause to be slain a traitor and disloyal tyrant, especially when he is a man of such mighty power that justice cannot well be done by the sovereign. This principle once laid down, Jean Petit proceeded to apply it to the Duke of Burgundy, causing to be slain that criminal tyrant, the Duke of Orleans, who was meditating the damnable design of thrusting aside the king and his children from their crown. And he drew from it the conclusion that the Duke of Burgundy ought not to be at all blamed or censured for what had happened in the person of the Duke of Orleans, and that the king not only ought to be displeased with him, but ought to hold the said Lord of Burgundy, as well as his deed, agreeable to him, and authorized by necessity. The defense thus concluded, letters were actually put before the king, running thus: "It is our will and pleasure that our cousin of Burgundy, his heirs and successors, be and abide at peace with us and our successors, in respect of the aforesaid deed, and all that hath followed thereon, and that by us, our said successors, our people and officers, no hindrance on account of that may be offered them either now or in time to come." Charles VI, weak in mind and will, even independently of his attacks, signed these letters and gave Duke John quite a kind reception, telling him, however, that he could cancel the penalty but not the resentment of everybody, and that it was for him to defend himself against perils which were probably imminent. The Duke answered proudly that so long as he stood in the king's good graces, he did not fear any man living. 3 days after this strange audience and this declaration, Queen Isabel, but lately on terms of the closest intimacy with the Duke of Orleans, who had been murdered on his way home after dining with her, was filled with alarm and set off suddenly for Melun, taking with her her son Louis the Dauphin, and accompanied by nearly all the princes, who, however, returned before long to Paris, being troubled by the displeasure the Duke of Burgundy testified at their departure. For more than 4 months, Duke John the Fearless remained absolute master of Paris, disposing of all posts, giving them to his own creatures, and putting himself on good terms with the university and the principal burgesses. A serious revolt among the lieges called for his presence in Flanders. The first troops he had sent against them had been repulsed, and he felt the necessity of going thither in person. But 2 months after his departure from Paris, on the 26th of August 1408, Queen Isabel returned thither from Melun with the Dauphin Louis, who for the first time rode on horseback, and with 3,000 men-at-arms. She set up her establishment at the Louvre. The Parisians shouted Noel as she passed along, and the Duke of Berry, the Duke of Bourbon, the Duke of Brittany the Constable, and all the great officers of the crown rallied round her. 2 days afterwards, on the 28th of August, the Duchess of Orleans arrived there from Blois in a black litter drawn by 4 horses caparisoned in black, and followed by a large number of mourning carriages. On the 5th of September, a state assembly was held at the Louvre. All the royal family, the princes and great officers of the crown, the presidents of the parliament, 15 archbishops or bishops, the provost of Paris, the provost of tradesmen, and 100 burgesses of note attended it. Thereupon Master Juvenal des Ursins, king's advocate, announced the intention of Charles VI in his illness to confer the government upon the queen, set forth the reasons for it, called to mind the able regency of Queen Blanche, mother of St. Louis, and produced royal letters sealed with the Great Seal. Immediately the Duchess of Orleans came forward, knelt at the Dauphin's feet, demanding justice for the death of her husband, and begged that she might have a day appointed her for refuting the calumnies with which it had been sought to blacken his memory. The Dauphin promised a speedy reply. On the 11th of September, accordingly, a new meeting of princes, lords, prelates, parliament, the university, and burgesses was held in the great hall of the Louvre. The Duchess of Orleans, the Duke her son, their chancellor, and the principal officers of her household were introduced, and leave was given to them to proceed with the justification of the late Duke of Orleans. It had been prepared beforehand. The Duchess placed the manuscript before the council as pledging herself unreservedly to all it contained, and Master Cerisy, Abbot of St. Fiacre, a monk of the Order of St. Benedict, read the document out publicly. It was a long and learned defense, in which the imputations made by the Cordelier Jean Petit against the late Duke of Orleans were effectually and in some part eloquently refuted. After the justification, Master Cousineau, advocate of the Duchess of Orleans, presented in person his demands against the Duke of Burgundy. They claimed that he should be bound to come without belt or chaperon, and disavow solemnly and publicly on his knees before the royal family, and also on the very spot where the crime was committed, the murder of the Duke of Orleans. After several other acts of reparation which were imposed upon him, he was to be sent into exile for 20 years beyond the seas, and on his return to remain at 20 leagues distance at least from the king and the royal family. After reacting these demands, which were more legitimate than practicable, the young Dauphin, well instructed as to what he had to say, addressed the Duchess of Orleans and her children in these terms: "We and all the princes of the blood royal here present, after having heard the justification of our uncle, the Duke of Orleans, have no doubt left touching the honor of his memory, and do hold him to be completely cleared of all that hath been said contrary to his reputation. As to the further demands you make, they shall be suitably provided for in course of justice." At this answer the assembly broke up. End of chapter 23, part 4.